The man known to history as Heinz Guderian was born as Heinz Wilhelm Guderian on the 17th of June 1888 in the town of Kulm, West Prussia, in the Kingdom of Prussia, within the German Empire. Today, Kulm is the town of Chełmno in northern Poland. His father was Friedrich Guderian. Friedrich came from a family with extensive experience serving in the Prussian military, one of the greatest land fighting forces in the 18th century. Prussia's repeated defeats at the hands of France during the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era damaged the Prussians' reputation. Following the end of the Napoleonic War, Prussia's leaders re-established their military dominance by the mid-19th century. The Guderian men, like many Prussian military families, viewed military service as a hereditary occupation, one which their sons and grandsons would engage in after them. Friedrich followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a Prussian military officer, rising to become a lieutenant in the 9th Jaeger Battalion, despite having joined the cadet school in 1872 and missed most of the major wars fought by Prussia between 1863 and 1871 against Denmark, Austria and France, which resulted in the emergence of the German Empire under the heavy influence of the Kingdom of Prussia. Heinz's mother was Alice Guderian. She and Friedrich married in 1887 and gave birth to Heinz, their first child, in 1888. A brother, Fritz, was born 2 years later in 1890. Heinz's youth was dictated by his father's military career. In 1891, when both he and Fritz were still infants, the young family moved to Colmar in the province of Alsace on the opposite end of the German Empire, one of the two provinces which Prussia had wrested from France during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. It, along with the other province seized, Lorraine, were heavily militarized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was done out of fear France would one day initiate a war of revenge. Friedrich Guderian and his family were just one of many military families that ended up here as a result, and in 1900, after 9 years in Alsace, the Guderians undertook the short move to St. Avold in Lorraine, not far from the regional capital Metz. Heinz did not spend long there. Although he was barely a teenager by modern standards, in 1901 he left home to follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps and become a military officer, joining the Karlsruher Cadet School in the province of Baden in southern Germany. Fritz joined him there 2 years later, the pair becoming versed in history, mathematics and several foreign languages, including French and English, before Heinz was transferred at 16 years of age to the Principal Cadet School in Berlin in 1904. Guderian spent the next 3 years in Berlin. He was clearly an accomplished student with an especially good memory and an aptitude for military history. The reports on him noted his promise, and when he completed his time at the cadet school, he was transferred to Metz in Lorraine, where he was commissioned under his father's battalion. He was also promoted to the rank of lieutenant in January 1908. His diary from these years indicates that while he was a young officer with much potential, he was somewhat socially aloof, with entries from his journal hinting at conflicts with fellow officers. Interestingly, after he had been in Metz for a year, and a cohort of new officers arrived from Berlin in the summer of 1908, he got along better with them. It was to be a lifelong tendency of Guderian's, in which he would find it difficult to find common ground with fellow commanders of an equal rank, but was well admired by more junior officers. The years prior to the First World War were also notable for Guderian's growing associations with a number of individuals who would become prominent figures in the German Wehrmacht in the 1930s, including Erich von Manstein and Guderian Keitel, brother of Wilhelm Keitel, the future head of the Wehrmacht during the Second World War. In October 1909, Guderian's unit was transferred to the Harz Mountains in the Saxony region of northern Germany. Shortly after his arrival, he met and began a relationship with Margarete Görner, or Gretel, as Heinz called her. Her father, Ernest, was not fond of Guderian, and when he proposed to her in December 1911, her father objected on the basis that she was just 18. This was hardly a young age to be married at in the early 20th century, and Heinz had only himself turned 23 a short time earlier. Reluctantly, they agreed to postpone marriage, although they did announce their engagement in February 1912. They finally married in October 1913. Their first son, a boy named Heinz after his father, followed soon after in August 1914, while a second son, named Kurt, came in 1918. Margarete had a tremendous influence in Guderian's career over the next several decades, encouraging his ambitions and putting up with his long absences, one of which occurred during their courtship when he had headed to Berlin for further training as a radio communications officer. Guderian's early years in the German military were during a time of growing tensions between Germany and many of the other European powers. For instance, in the spring of 1911, tensions had ratcheted up between Germany and France over both countries' efforts to gain influence in Morocco. The Agadir crisis, so named after the flashpoint being the port of Agadir in Morocco, lasted for half a year before a compromise was worked out whereby French influence over Morocco was agreed to and German Cameroon was expanded with a grant of French territory in the Congo. This was just one of several near misses when it came to the possible development of a European war. Somewhat surprisingly to many Europeans, the next European war began not out of colonial rivalries, but instead because of a Balkan conflict between Austria and Russia in the summer of 1914. By early August, the conflict had exploded as each of the major powers declared war on each other. Germany, allied with Austria, found itself at war with Britain, France, and Russia. Much of the most intense fighting over the next 4 years would be on the trenches of the Western Front in northeastern France. When the war broke out, Guderian was in the midst of his apprenticeship as a communications officer, but he soon began serving as a first lieutenant in France, where his reputation as a promising military commander was cemented. In the spring of 1915, Guderian was assigned as a signals or communications officer in the 4th Army, which had formed the core of the German force which invaded Belgium in August 1914, alongside the 5th Army. It remained in Belgium throughout the war. Guderian was assigned to the 4th during the Second Battle of Ypres in the summer of 1915. He subsequently was sent to France as part of the Battle of Verdun in 1916, the longest engagement of the entire war on the Western Front. It was while Guderian and others were fighting at Verdun that the first tanks were employed in the history of warfare at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette in mid-September 1916, an engagement of the wider First Battle of the Somme. The first models were devised by the British and were designed to try and break the deadlock of trench warfare that had come about as a result of the widespread use of machine guns on the Western Front. The first tanks were developed as giant moving metal boxes that would protect soldiers from enemy machine gun fire as they traversed no man's land between the trenches. The French would become the primary producers and users of tanks down to the end of the war. Conversely, the Germans barely tried to adopt the new weaponry during the First World War. They would only do so in later years, becoming the preeminent masters of tank warfare in the 1930s. Guderian gave exemplary service during the First World War and was successively promoted from lieutenant to captain, then placed in charge of an infantry division, and finally admitted to the General Staff Corps in February 1918, an event which Guderian later described as the proudest moment of my life. By the time Guderian joined the General Staff, the outcome of the war was looking inevitable. The United States had joined the conflict on the side of the British and the French in 1917, and with men and resources pouring into Western Europe from North America in the months that followed, the stalemate was broken in northeastern France. By the autumn of 1918, the German position was desperate, as Guderian would have been well aware. He and the rest of the General Staff were particularly shaken by the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, wherein the French and British deployed hundreds of tanks and had a devastating impact in the engagement. The Germans suffered a major defeat, but Guderian learned an early lesson about the benefits of tank warfare from it, as he related years later in his writings promoting the large-scale adoption of tank divisions in the German army. After Amiens, the German lines were in danger of collapsing entirely, but in the end, it was a revolution and collapse of the imperial government back in Germany in early November 1918 which brought about an armistice and an end to the war, rather than the taking of the conflict into Germany. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany not only lost extensive territory in the east to re-establish Poland as a sovereign nation, but it was forced to demilitarize extensively, with the German Imperial Army replaced by a Reichswehr, which was capped at 100,000 troops. As a result, the vast majority of German soldiers were decommissioned in 1919 and 1920, as were a very large proportion of Germany's military officers. Guderian's wartime record served him well, and he was one of the 4,000 men selected to remain as officers in the new Reichswehr. The years that followed were chaotic ones for Guderian and more so for Germany. The end of the war did not bring peace to Europe, which spent the next 5 years dealing with revolutions, wars of independence, civil wars, and the wreckage of the Spanish flu pandemic. Germany was one of the worst affected, with 1919 being characterized to a large extent by civil war in the country, particularly so in cities like Berlin and Munich, as communist groups tried to follow the example of the Russian Revolution to establish a radical socialist state. Owing to the unrest, Guderian was not free to return to his young family once the war ended. Instead, he ended up being assigned to the Eastern Frontier Force under General Heinz von Seeckt, which was charged from early 1919 onwards with defending Germany's eastern border by ensuring that the Russian Civil War and the wars of independence attendant on it in Poland and the Baltic States region did not spill over into Germany. There, he was involved in military action as far northeast as the city of Riga, but he and his colleagues were devastated to learn in the course of this campaign that they were fighting for nothing, as it had been decided at the peace talks in France that this region would be stripped from the German state as part of the Treaty of Versailles. Guderian's nationalistic politics were only encouraged by these events, and the sense of injustice which he and many other former military men felt in 1919. As the initial chaos of 1919 gave way to the early 1920s, Guderian's new military position became clearer within the general staff of the Reichswehr. In 1922, he was assigned the task of investigating the concept of motorization within the German army. Under the terms of Versailles, the Reichswehr had not only been limited to 100,000 men, but had also been banned from developing either an air force or having tank divisions. But the government of Weimar Germany in the interwar period constantly tried to stretch these restrictions, and Guderian was one of several officers charged with ensuring that when the time came to try to introduce a tank division into the Reichswehr, they would have the technical know-how to do so efficiently. In this, he worked closely with Ernst Volkheim, one of the few German commanders who had been involved in developing strategies for the use of tanks during the war. He also read whatever he could find in terms of technical manuals from abroad, notably from Britain, where rapid innovations in tank design were being made in the 1920s, and the development of tank strategy was being furthered under the aegis of the experimental mechanized force. In 1924, Guderian's talents in military history and strategy were recognized in his appointment to the military training school at Stettin, which was in German Prussia at the time, but which is just over the German-Polish border today. There, he was primarily a military historian, but he had many other roles. For instance, there were years in which he was writing extensively, producing reports on military strategy, and also subtly introducing his political views into his discussions, arguing that a failure to adopt tank warfare during the First World War had contributed significantly to Germany's defeat. This was an oversimplification, but it does indicate his growing belief in the necessity of the extensive use of motorized divisions in modern warfare, and the Reichswehr was preparing for this in line with his reports. While the government was prohibited from creating divisions at home in Germany in the second half of the 1920s, it began developing a small number of tanks and testing them in Sweden and in a base near the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, thus circumventing the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. In return, the Russians received technical advice from a German officer corps which was still the most skillful and knowledgeable in Europe on many military matters. Guderian's life would be changed immensely, like those of tens of millions of others across Europe, by the events of the late 1920s and early 1930s. The Wall Street crash occurred in the autumn of 1929, leading to an immense economic crisis across the Western world and the Great Depression. Germany was one of the worst affected countries, with spiraling inflation and unemployment leading to immense economic damage and a turbulent political environment. This allowed for the rise of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis, under their leader Adolf Hitler, which rose from being a minor political party with a tiny amount of support in Bavaria in the 1920s to become the second biggest party nationally in the elections of September 1930, and then the biggest in 1932. Early in 1933, Hitler worked out an arrangement with the centrist parties and business leaders of Germany whereby he would become Chancellor of the country. Within weeks, they had secured complete control over the state apparatus, transforming the country into a one-party state based on the anti-Semitic, anti-communist, and ultra-nationalist ideology of the Nazis, who were determined to launch a new European war to make Germany the preeminent political and military power on the continent. Over time, in the 1930s, Guderian would become more and more central to their military planning. Guderian's progress within the German military during the Nazi rise in popularity in the early 1930s and seizure of power in 1933 was closely tied to Oswald Lutz. Lutz had risen within the Bavarian divisions of the German Imperial Army in the 1890s and 1900s, before specializing as well in the motorized divisions in the 1920s. As a considerably more senior ranking and older officer than Guderian, he was appointed in 1931 as Inspector of the Motorized Transport Troops and Major General. He hired Guderian as his Chief of Staff. It was during the early stages of their collaboration, before the Nazis had ever come to power, that Lutz and Guderian began overseeing the development of a new German light tank called the Panzerkampfwagen, meaning armoured fighting vehicle, though this model and the subsequent models built down to 1945 are today more widely known simply as Panzers. This breach of the Versailles Treaty was undertaken in secret, while Guderian, Lutz, and others within the motorized division continued to develop strategies for how tank divisions would operate alongside infantry units to move speedily in campaigns. Something of a misnomer, though, is the idea that Guderian or anyone else was working on the idea of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, during these years. There are only a handful of references within German military documents from the 1930s referring to Blitzkrieg, and where these appear, they more often than not involve discussion of how an army could be effectively supplied with food and ammunition if it was moving forward swiftly in a military invasion. Guderian and Lutz's early work in establishing production of the first Panzers in 1932 was given a notable boost from 1935 onwards as the Nazis intensified the program of German rearmament, which in reality had been underway in a clandestine manner since the late 1920s. Though Britain and France politely objected, they did nothing in practice to oppose these moves. As this occurred, Guderian became the foremost advocate within the German military of the idea of developing a major Panzerwaffe, or panzer wing, to the military as a means of having fast-moving armies that could strike against Germany's enemies in any future war. But his and Lutz's arguments often met with opposition, particularly from Hermann Göring, who wanted resources pumped into his Luftwaffe Air Force instead. In response, Guderian, with Lutz's encouragement, began working on a book promoting tank warfare in 1936 and published it the following year as Achtung, Panzer, or Attention, Tank, though it could also be transliterated as Beware the Tank. Though he did not apply the term, the basic tenets of Blitzkrieg warfare, with the use of fast-moving tank divisions accompanied by infantry divisions and air support, were described by Guderian. His efforts were not an overnight success, but production of the Panzer I continued steadily, and the Panzer II was soon in production. Buoyed by the experience of the Spanish Civil War, in which the utility of tanks was further demonstrated, by the end of the 1930s, thousands of Panzers had been built or were under construction, while the Panzer III and Panzer IV, the most successful operation tanks used by the Germans during the war, were under development from 1936 onwards. That the Panzer program was as advanced as it was in Germany by the time the war broke out in September 1939 was, in large part, owing to the championing of it by Lutz and Guderian. Despite their collaboration through the 1930s, Guderian and Lutz would not work with each other beyond the first weeks of 1938. While Germany had rearmed and the wider country was firmly under the dictatorial rule of the Nazis by the mid-1930s, many senior commanders within the military retained an independent political stance, particularly the War Minister Werner von Blomberg and the Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, Werner von Fritsch. These were individuals who shared the fervent nationalism of the Nazis, but were otherwise not committed National Socialists. In advance of the coming war, Hitler moved to get rid of them early in 1938 and did so by exploiting a marriage scandal and concocting charges of homosexuality against von Fritsch in order to force them out of their posts and replace them with more loyal individuals. Von Blomberg and von Fritsch, however, were just the most publicly visible faces of this purge, and many other officers were removed or demoted in tandem in 1938. These included Oswald Lutz, Guderian's collaborator and senior commander. In a betrayal of his close advisor, Guderian, whose relationship with Hitler and the Nazis was much better, and who was becoming a committed Nazi over time, accepted the position as head of the motorized divisions which had been vacated by Lutz. Guderian was becoming more prominent within the German military just as the race to war was speeding up. Initially, Hitler and the other senior leaders of the Nazis intended to wait until as late as 1942 or 1943 before launching a war, but as they had rearmed speedily in the mid-1930s, Britain and France were extremely slow to respond. In light of this, Hitler pushed ahead in the first months of 1938 with the Nazi goal of uniting Germany and Austria into a Greater Germany under the rule of Berlin, a political union which was specifically prohibited under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Political pressure was applied on the Fatherland Front government of Austria, and eventually, in mid-March 1938, German armed divisions rolled into Austria to complete a bloodless annexation of Austria. Guderian was part of the Austrian operation, but it was not a success for him, with the tank divisions moving slowly towards Vienna amidst poor communications. More successful was Guderian's role in the occupation of the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia in the autumn of 1938. By then, Britain and France's willingness to appease Germany had been stretched to breaking point, but it somehow lasted beyond the full annexation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. It was only when the Nazis invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939 that Britain and France finally declared war. The Second World War had now begun. Guderian and his Panzers were involved in the war from the very beginning. He personally led the 19th Panzer Corps over the border, proceeding with speed over the Polish corridor, which was relatively well defended, and passing by his birthplace at Kulm on his way towards Warsaw. The Polish capital had been surrounded by mid-September. A 2-week siege followed before German troops entered the city on the 1st of October. Guderian's divisions had operated well during this push. One of the benefits he was able to bring to the campaign was his effective use of radio communications, even as his corps moved speedily eastwards, combining his earlier experience as a communications officer with his more recent role as a tank commander. As the campaign neared its end, he received a message from Hitler inquiring if his reaching of all of his targets on time or ahead of schedule had been a result of the Polish troops in front of his divisions having been weakened by the bombing raids conducted by Göring's Luftwaffe. Guderian responded succinctly, "No, by our panzers." Hitler was impressed, and it was not just him, as many within the Nazi government and the military high command were now convinced of the efficacy of swift-moving tank divisions as a forward unit in invasion campaigns. The invasion of Poland was also significant in terms of Guderian's growing knowledge of the crimes of the Nazi regime. When the invasion commenced, the Nazis had already drawn up lists of tens of thousands of Poles who were political, cultural, and religious leaders of various kinds, with the goal of either murdering them, or detaining them during and after the invasion. The goal of Operation Tannenberg, as it was termed after a major battle which the German Empire had won against Russia in Poland in the first weeks of the First World War, was to rob Poland of its political and moral leadership, a form of genocide in and of itself, according to many definitions of genocide. Between September 1939 and January 1940, a minimum of 20,000 people were killed, tens of thousands more were arrested, and the numbers may have been significantly higher. Thereafter, the corralling of the country's massive Jewish population into ghettos in Warsaw, Krakow, and other towns and cities, and the systemic starving of them began. Guderian had left Poland and returned to Germany before much of this was initiated, so he didn't witness much of it personally at this early stage in the war, but he was aware that it was occurring on report by his son and namesake, Heinz Jr., who had joined the military like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, and was also involved in the invasion and subsequent occupation of Poland. Consequently, Guderian was aware of the atrocities of the regime from early on in the war. The significance of this will become clearer later, as Guderian became one of the major proponents of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, which following the war saw leading German military commanders claim that they were unaware of the extent of the war crimes being perpetrated by the Nazis. Guderian was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the highest military honor within the German Wehrmacht, for his role in the invasion of Poland. He was also promoted to a position of consultancy on the plans for the invasion of France, which were being worked out in late 1939 and into 1940. His involvement was encouraged by Erich von Manstein, who had known Guderian for more than a quarter of a century, since when they were beginning their military careers. The plan for the invasion of France was to bypass the extensive band of fortifications and defences which the French had erected along the Franco-German border, known as the Maginot Line, by repeating exactly what the Germans had done in 1914, invading Belgium. There was a debate, though, as to whether to proceed through the Ardennes forest, which is largely located in Luxembourg and Belgium, or further to the north, exclusively through Belgium. The former plan was eventually decided on when Guderian stated that he could bring his motorized divisions speedily through the hilly forests of the Ardennes region and then carry on towards the coast of the English Channel. Guderian's 19th Army Corps would consequently largely lead the invasion of the Low Countries and France. The invasion of the Low Countries and France commenced on the 10th of May 1940 after months of the Allies waiting for the German campaign to begin. Guderian's 19th Corps moved quickly through the Ardennes and was involved with other divisions in the Battle of Sedan between the 12th and the 15th, the site where the Germans elected to mass their forces to cross the River Meuse. The plan to navigate the river here was largely Guderian's idea, and he won out over Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt, who wished to cross the river elsewhere. After winning a major victory at Sedan and crossing the river, Guderian began a rapid pincer movement as he drove the 19th Corps towards the English Channel, with the goal of cutting the British Expeditionary Force off from the main French army further to the south. Guderian's forces led the race to the sea, and on the 21st of May he was able to report back that the British and some French divisions had been cut off. Such was the speed of the advance that when Hitler and the High Command received updates of the 19th Corps' location in mid-May, that they believed they were receiving inaccurate information, and that Guderian could not have advanced westwards as quickly as he had. This was not just the efficacy of tank warfare. Guderian's troops were also awake for days on end during the drive to the English Channel, fueled by pervitin, a form of amphetamine which Guderian had begun having his tank crews issued with during 1939. However, to his disappointment, the success in surrounding the British at the French port of Dunkirk so quickly was not followed up on with a full barrage of the expeditionary force there, as Goering delayed matters by wanting to bomb the British into oblivion, allowing him to claim that his Luftwaffe had been responsible for the destruction of the British expeditionary force. Instead, during the delay, the famous evacuation of Dunkirk was effected from the 26th of May onwards. As he was dispatched southwards to secure parts of eastern France southwards to Switzerland, Guderian must have fumed that the success of his Panzer divisions in executing such a rapid advance through northern France was not fully capitalized on. Nevertheless, while the British evacuated their troops and lived to fight another day, Paris was entered by the Nazis on the 14th of June, and France surrendered on the 25th. Guderian's advance into France in May 1940 and the subsequent cutting off of the British expeditionary force at Dunkirk led to a growing belief in the efficacy of Blitzkrieg during the Second World War. In November 1940, Guderian was promoted again as his divisions were expanded into the 2nd Panzer Group, which would later be made into the 2nd Panzer Army. This rapid growth came as hundreds of panzers were manufactured in the Reich every month. This was all in anticipation of the invasion of the Soviet Union, with Hitler determining that the campaign, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, would begin in the summer of 1941. This was to be initiated without defeating Britain first, Hitler's ideological rigidity having convinced him that the British would eventually see sense and join with Germany once it saw the real enemy were the Bolshevik communists of Russia. Guderian was one of the more vocal opponents within the high command of the Wehrmacht to the idea of opening a second front in Eastern Europe while Britain remained undefeated. But his objections were completely ignored. Defeated in this, Guderian tried to make the best of a bad situation and began impressing on Hitler and the other senior members of the Nazi regime that tank production would need to be increased significantly in order to begin producing upwards of 800 tanks a month. This was not realistically achievable, and while an increase was seen, it was nowhere near what Guderian believed to be necessary. While believing the invasion to be too soon, Guderian was a supporter of the Nazi desire to create Lebensraum, or living room, for Germans by conquering Eastern Europe, a sign of his growing adherence to more elements of Nazism. The goal of Operation Barbarossa was to advance into the Soviet Union at immense speed and defeat the Soviets in a matter of weeks, much as had happened in France a year earlier. And, for a time, when the invasion commenced on the 22nd of June 1941, it seemed as though this might be reality, as the Germans rolled across hundreds of kilometers of territory in the space of a few weeks. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was on the front lines as part of Army Group Center under the overall command of Fedor von Bock. This prong of the invasion achieved a number of spectacular successes in the first 6 weeks of the invasion, driving towards the city of Minsk in Belarus once the fighting began and encircling a vast portion of the Red Army at the end of June. Guderian's panzers were directly involved in closing off the Minsk pocket and allowing for the capture of several 100,000 Russian troops in one of the biggest tactical victories won by the Germans in the entire war. This done, Guderian's tanks were again responsible for a complete encirclement of the Soviets, this time surrounding the 13th Army after a surprise movement over the river Dnieper to Smolensk in mid-July. Though the easy victories ended, and although the wider Battle of Smolensk was a major German victory on paper, it led to over 100,000 German troops being killed, wounded or captured, and slowed the advance on Moscow, a delay which ultimately resulted in the capital not being seized by the Nazis before the Russian winter set in. Guderian had already been dispatched to the southeast before the Battle of Smolensk ended in September 1941. He did so with the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, a new honour which Hitler had introduced in 1940. The goal of his diversion was to join the Battle of Kiev. Against the wishes of many of his generals, Hitler had insisted on prioritizing the capture of the Ukrainian capital above Moscow, believing there was ample time to take Kiev and then Moscow before the winter. Von Bock and Guderian both objected to this strategy, believing Moscow should be prioritized, but when they met with Hitler, Guderian's nerve failed him, and after Hitler presented the case for proceeding on to Moscow, Guderian largely backed down and placated Hitler, later stating that the decision had already been made, and as a Prussian officer, he was duty-bound to implement the directives of the government. Thus, in later August, his 2nd Panzer Group moved south to Kiev to aid in the encirclement of the city. In the end, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were captured in the Ukrainian offensive, and the Soviets lost 600,000 men cumulatively. But again, the diversion had delayed the strike on Moscow as the winter loomed ever nearer. By the time Moscow became the priority again in late September and early October, the number of functional German tanks across the Eastern Front had nearly halved. Production was ramping up in Central Europe, but it still could not meet the rate of attrition on the front lines. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was badly affected, with only a quarter of the tanks he had led into eastern Poland and Belorussia in late June still being operational. Nevertheless, he was ordered to the Russian capital, where he was assured new units would be available. It was here that Guderian would fail to achieve major victories for the first time. His divisions did win a substantial victory at Bryansk, completing another massively damaging encirclement of the Soviet 3rd, 13th and 50th Armies, but the effort to follow this up by capturing the Tula region was a step too far. Here, Guderian's tanks became bogged down for the first time, and it took 3 weeks of intense fighting between Army Group Center and the Red Army before the outskirts of Tula were reached, dramatically slowing the overall progress towards Moscow. Consequently, it was early November before the Germans began closing on the capital, and by this time, the cracks in the invasion strategy were multiplying, with a drastic lack of supplies and number of fully operational tanks and motorized vehicles having plummeted. Even worse, the worst winter that would be seen in the 20th century was beginning, and temperatures plummeted at times to nearly minus 40 degrees Celsius in Russia, causing the diesel in the engines of the German panzers to freeze, eventualities which Guderian, Lutz, and the other advocates of tank warfare over the past 10 years had never prepared for. It was not just Guderian who was beginning to suffer his first setbacks. So was the wider Nazi state. The German advance into the Soviet Union had been incredibly swift in the late summer and autumn of 1941, but the invasion first slowed and then stalled in the early winter outside Moscow and Leningrad. As the bitter Russian winter arrived, German soldiers, who were ill-prepared for the brutal weather, died in large numbers for the first time during the war. At the very same time, Germany's new ally, the Empire of Japan, initiated a war against the United States in December 1941. This brought the Americans into the war in Europe as well. The first major signs of the impact of US involvement in the conflict were seen in North Africa, where the Italians and German North Africa Corps had nearly succeeded in seizing Egypt and the Suez Canal in 1941. In the course of 1942 and early 1943, the Allies won the campaign here and soon opened a southern front in Europe with an invasion of Sicily and southern Italy. Yet all of this paled by comparison with the disaster which began to unfold on the Eastern Front for the Nazis. In the autumn of 1942, Hitler focused his energies on securing the city of Stalingrad in southwestern Russia, and from there the oil fields of the region beyond, as a means of depriving the Soviets of the fuel. It led in early 1943 to the first massive defeat experienced by the Wehrmacht, with the virtual destruction of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. From this juncture, the Germans were fighting a defensive war as the Soviets began pushing them back westwards into Belorussia, Ukraine, and then Poland. Guderian was largely uninvolved in the war effort while these reverses were occurring. On the 26th of December 1941, after his divisions had been involved in several failed missions, including an inability to fully secure Tula, Guderian was dismissed from active service. Von Bock had been relieved of the command of Army Group Center when he was unable to proceed any further than a position where his divisions could see Moscow in the distance but not seize the city. Guderian did not get along with his successor, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge. The tank commander had also visited Hitler in his Wolf's Lair headquarters in Prussia and pleaded for a withdrawal or some other measure to look towards the welfare of the men of Army Group Center in the freezing weather. This was not only refused, but accelerated Hitler's decision to dismiss Guderian. Heinz also suffered a mild heart attack around this time, and his ailing health led him to return to Germany and to not petition for a new command throughout 1942. Guderian retained close correspondence with many German commanders through this career hiatus. Eventually, a call came from the Führer in February 1943 to resume his military life, no doubt spurred by the disaster at Stalingrad and Hitler's increasing tendency to cycle through generals who had displeased him. By 1943, Hitler was coming back to those he had dismissed earlier. In this instance, he promoted Guderian to become Inspector General of the Panzer troops, effectively making him the operational head of tank warfare in the Third Reich. In this post, Guderian did not lead divisions of tanks at the front, but instead largely operated from Germany and Poland, collaborating with individuals like the newly appointed Minister for Armaments, Albert Speer, to ensure that tank production was maximized. Much of this was achieved through the slave labor of Czechs, Poles, and Ukrainians in German factories, something Guderian was entirely aware of. It was also hampered by an ideological insistence by Hitler that tanks should be replaced by new tanks, whereas Guderian had informed Speer that many damaged tanks could be repaired effectively, much faster and with less expense. His range of responsibilities increased even beyond this over time. In the summer and autumn of 1944, for instance, as the Russians pushed the German armies towards Poland and then Germany, he drew up the Guderian Plan, a large scheme for the erection of defensive lines across Eastern Europe along the course of rivers like the Oder and Vistula, as well as through additional fortifying of cities like Danzig and Posen. As such, while most of Guderian's major successes on the battlefield were won in the first years of the war, he was never in a more senior position within the military than the 2-year period after his recall and promotion in the spring of 1943. Much of this was the result of the trust which Hitler placed in Guderian. The tank commander was almost unquestionably a committed Nazi by this time, swerving little from any established ideologies and doctrines. This would explain why, when an attempt was made to kill Hitler and several other senior Nazi ministers before overthrowing the government in July 1944, Guderian was appointed to chair the honor court which was set up to prosecute hundreds of military officers connected in any form with the leaders of the plot. Many were tortured and executions were carried out in a brutal fashion. Guderian later claimed that he had been reluctant to undertake the task and had only agreed to do so in the tense environment of late July 1944, when a refusal to carry out orders could just as easily have led to him being tortured and executed. Yet there is no evidence to suggest that he was reluctant in any way. Conversely, in the days that followed, he was heavily involved in a campaign for the total Nazification of the army by demanding that all officers serving anywhere in German territory were to join the Nazi Party and swear oaths of allegiance. The events of July 1944 came with a promotion. On the 21st of July, the day after the attempted assassination of Hitler, Guderian was appointed as the Chief of the General Army Staff, effectively placing him in charge of the administration and organization of the Wehrmacht. There were still more senior commanders than him, but Guderian now ran much of the day-to-day organization between different branches and departments and was in charge of staff on a general level within the command corps. This added to his responsibilities, which were largely focused on slowing the Russian advance. This had been made more difficult by the Battle of Kursk that raged for 7 weeks in Russia between early July and late August 1943. This was the largest tank battle in history, involving over 3,000 German tanks all told, but it resulted in the complete loss of hundreds of tanks and damage being inflicted on well over 1,000 more. When combined with the new fronts being opened in Italy and then in France with the D-Day landings, Guderian could not replace the resources which were being lost, and after the autumn of 1944, the Russian advance began to speed up as cracks in the German lines developed in Poland and Ukraine. Even as he was overseeing the honor court in Berlin, Guderian was also keeping an eye on the Russian advance on Warsaw, which neither he nor the other senior German commanders could do much to halt. Matters only became more difficult in the months that followed, as Hitler became determined to pull vital resources away from the Eastern Front to launch a counter-offensive in the West for what eventually became the Ardennes Offensive, or the Battle of the Bulge. The last months of the war were peculiar ones for Guderian, ones in which he would rapidly rise to become one of the closest confidants within the military of many of the most senior Nazi figures, but then just as quickly be dismissed. By the winter of 1944, he was viewed as a completely trustworthy figure, one who would follow orders to the bitter end, even as teenage boys and pensioners were being armed to defend the home country against the final Soviet push into Germany early in 1945. Tellingly, he was increasingly allied with Heinrich Himmler during this period, the individual who had built the SS into an ideological machine and was in charge of overseeing the concentration camp system across Europe. Such a close relationship makes it very difficult not to assume that Guderian was fully aware of what had happened in the death camps in Poland over the previous 3 years. But while he was aligning himself with Himmler, who was clandestinely trying to discover what terms German surrender might be considered by the Western Allies, Guderian was increasingly at odds with Hitler, a drug-addled figure in the final stages of the war, racked by ill health and delusional. In numerous meetings between the Führer and his senior commanders in the first months of 1945, as related by Albert Speer in his lengthy memoirs years later, Guderian clashed with Hitler, arguing against measures which he saw as being reckless or counterproductive. For several months, this was allowed. Yet, eventually, Hitler's patience wore thin when matters came to a head on the 27th of March 1945. At this meeting, Hitler asked everyone else except Keitel and Guderian to leave the room before informing Guderian that he needed to take 6 weeks of sick leave to recover from whatever was ailing him. He was effectively being relieved of his positions. It would not matter anyway. 5 weeks later, Hitler committed suicide in the same bunker where he had relieved Guderian of his duties. A week after Hitler's death, the war came to an end. Guderian surrendered to the Allies on the 10th of May, 1945. Like many other Germans, Guderian was detained for some time once the war came to an end, as the Allies attempted to resolve the enormously complex issues of who was going to be charged with crimes. Guderian was one of a great many senior and middling German military officers who would not be charged with the more serious crimes, such as fomenting the war or engaging in genocide and war crimes. Instead, figureheads were chosen to stand trial as part of the marquee trials being held before the International Tribunal at Nuremberg in the years following the war. In the case of the Wehrmacht, Wilhelm Keitel, brother of Guderian, who Guderian had known for nearly 40 years, was placed on trial and executed at Nuremberg as the head of the armed forces. Other senior generals were given life sentences or years in prison. Guderian avoided all this, despite efforts by the re-established Polish government to have him extradited to Poland and stand trial there for various crimes committed in Poland during the war. The Western Allies refused to punish or extradite Guderian, primarily because he was acting as an informant within the US CIA. At the time, there was admittedly little evidence to tie him to war crimes, though in the decades since, it became apparent that he was aware of the regime's more sinister actions and that he was largely a committed Nazi. After undertaking denazification and being released in 1948, Guderian retired to southern Germany and resumed his writing. He published 2 books in the early 1950s, Kann Westeuropa verteidigt werden? Or Can Western Europe be defended? Published in 1950. This book explored the position of West Germany as a bulwark against the Western expansion of the Soviet Union. It was deliberately written with the intention of creating the idea that former Nazis and German military commanders were now the natural allies of the US, Britain, and France against Russian communists. A great many politicians in these countries agreed with him, and in the early 1950s, several of Guderian's former colleagues within the General Staff of the Wehrmacht had their prison sentences drastically reduced and were returned to civil society to begin working for the armed forces of West Germany. More widely read was Guderian's memoir Panzer Leader, published in Germany in 1950 and then in an English translation in 1952. In it, Guderian presented himself as the great innovator in tank warfare and the architect of Blitzkrieg, an interpretation which was accepted for years by historians, but which has been tempered in recent decades by an understanding that while Guderian played a significant role in advocating for a major motorized element to the German Wehrmacht, he was just one of several innovators in this regard, and the Panzer program owed as much to Oswald Lutz and even the British developments in tank warfare in the 1920s, which Guderian learned much from. Panzer Leader was a major success with the German public and abroad, and by 1977 it had gone through 10 editions. Guderian's books also contributed to the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. This was the interpretation of the war which was pushed by Guderian and others like von Manstein through memoirs and autobiographies in the 1950s. They argued that the German military commanders were not actually acting in unison with the Nazi regime. They tried to present themselves as honor-bound military officers in the old Prussian tradition who were not responsible for the worst crimes perpetrated by Hitler, his ministers, and the SS. They stated that the military elite were allegedly unaware of what was happening to the Jews and other groups. Some even tried to suggest that they were opposed to the regime, but continued to serve out of patriotic nationalism. For many years, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht was believed in many circles, but as historians have produced biographical studies of figures like Guderian, von Manstein, Keitel, and others over the past half-century, it has been possible to identify that they had clear and extensive knowledge of the Holocaust and other crimes, made no efforts to object to these policies, and in many instances were guilty of war crimes themselves on the Eastern Front. Guderian's final years were spent in the glow of the minor celebrity status which he had achieved through his writings, with publications as far afield as the Times in London discussing a prediction he had made that if the United States committed too many resources to fighting the Korean War or involving itself in trying to stop communism replacing French colonial rule in Indochina, it might leave Western Europe vulnerable to Soviet aggression. He also maintained a vibrant correspondence with many of his former colleagues from the General Staff of the Wehrmacht during the war. At the same time, his health was failing him as he entered his mid-60s. He died on the 14th of May 1954 at the age of 65 in his adopted homeland in Schwangau. With his own home place in Poland now under Soviet control, there was to be no burial there. Instead, he was laid to rest in his wife Margarethe's family plot in Goslar in Saxony. A year after his death, West Germany was admitted to the US-led North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and 6 months later a new West German army, the Bundeswehr, was created. It was the realization of the political and military rehabilitation that Guderian had campaigned for in his final years. His son and namesake, Heinz Guderian, served as a tank commander in this new force, and before his retirement in 1974, rose to the position of Inspector of Panzer Troops, the post his father had held decades earlier under the Nazis. Heinz Guderian was one of the most important of Germany's military commanders during the Second World War. There is no doubt of his importance in the development of the Panzer tank program and the centrality of fast-moving motorized divisions within the Wehrmacht during the 1930s. Furthermore, he was the commander who led the rapid race to the sea in May 1940 and cut the British Expeditionary Force off from the main French army. Had it not been for Hermann Göring's desire for the Luftwaffe to claim the victory over the British thereafter, the British force might well have been obliterated at Dunkirk in the week following Guderian's action. However, it is excessive to suggest that Guderian was the architect of Blitzkrieg, and that this has even been suggested owes more to his own self-promotion through his writings than anything else. He certainly did contribute enormously to the development of Germany's tank program prior to the war, but others did as well, and the Germans were also drawing on technical work undertaken by the British in the 1920s. Moreover, his staggering success in the French campaign was not matched on the Eastern Front, where Guderian faced tougher odds. There was insufficient evidence to charge him with complicity in the regime's crimes at that time, but much has been revealed in the interim which paints him in a damning light. Consequently, we have here an ultranationalist, one whose political views were broadly aligned with the Nazis and became more so over time, while also being aware of, and at times complicit in, its crimes. What do you think of Heinz Guderian? Was he the architect of the Blitzkrieg, and one of the most skilled of all the German commanders during the Second World War? Or were his victories primarily due to being in a hugely advantageous position, such as during the invasions of Poland and France? Please, let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.